Hey everyone, it's Grandmaster Josh Friedel. I just wanted to do a follow-up to my previous video on how to handle opening surprises because I had 4 positions prepared and it took me over half an hour to get through 2. I'm a very slow person. So I definitely wanted to cover these other examples though because I thought they were great. Probably throughout the candidates, I'll be looking for games because I'm always watching them, and I'll be looking for games where I think there are great lessons to learn. I try to make it kind of universal so that anyone can learn from it. There might be some videos I do where maybe beginners or advanced novice players might get more from it. Others where I'd say most of my videos fall in like intermediate players could learn from them, but even slightly more advanced. But I really try to make it so that there are lessons that players of a lot of levels can learn just to create the greatest appeal and all of that. But I try to mix it up. In any case, a lot of it also is just kind of sharing what I learn also as I look through these games. So once again, I wanted to remind you that my Chessable course is out and currently on sale. I believe when this video gets published, it will still be on sale. So definitely check it out. It's $10 for a whole 60 problems, 60 exercises with variations and explanations. There's a link below. If you want video with it, so it's basically like a mini lesson, then it's only $30 total. So not a terrible deal. So you can check the link below. And as always, like if you like what I do and appreciate it, I always like to see your comments. All the like, subscribe, all that stuff is all good for me. So let us get to it. So this game was between Vidit and Praggnanandhaa. This was an interesting one because Vidit had beaten Nakamura the day before. We're actually going to cover that one too. I want to see the position a little bit. I'm actually going to cover that one afterwards. That'll be my second example. But I wanted to show this Vidit Praggnanandhaa game because it was a very interesting situation because Praggnanandhaa had lost the day before and Vidit had won. So Praggnanandhaa was a whole point ahead of him, and really the candidates is a long event, but if you fall behind too much, it can be very difficult because wins are hard to come by. So Praggnanandhaa clearly wanted to mix up the game. So is a Roy Lopez. So people are thinking, oh man, we're going to get another Berlin. Not the most boring opening. If you checked out the game where Nepomniachtchi was able to beat Vidit, I believe, that was a Berlin, and it looked very, very nice for white. But I actually think the end game is really interesting. It's just most people avoid it, and the top guys seem to know all their stuff. Although, again, Nepo really did well there. So this was a6, bishop a4, and then Praggnanandhaa plays f5. So I would call this the Schliemann deferred. A lot of people call it the delayed Yanish or something like that. Schliemann deferred is what I called it. My first coach actually played the Schliemann, the regular Schliemann, which is in this position f5, which is funnily enough a completely different opening. He played that, so I actually played f5 my whole childhood. That was my childhood opening. It's amazing I made it, but it was a lot of fun. What was quite interesting though is that the way you handle each move is actually very different. For example, in this position, most people either play knight c3. The idea being that after pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, if you play d5, I can take on e5. This leads to a huge complications, of course, but it's quite interesting. And if knight f6, you have various options. There's queen e2. You could even take the thing. You can, different ways you can handle it. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in these positions. And there's also d3, which is a more simple approach, is also quite playable here. The move d4, which is kind of, you'll see why this move is relevant, also is playable here. But it involves a piece sack because you have this option and black has this move. So the idea is that if you move the bishop, for example, here, I can play check and pick up this pawn, and that's a rather crucial pawn. I'm threatening to go here. So this is actually really disastrous for white if you allow stuff like this generally. So usually white actually plays this, allows you to take the bishop and then here. And this is actually a really deadly piece sack because you have the black can barely develop any pieces. And in fact, the way you're supposed to handle this is by playing d5. So you allow them to take en passant and then you get your knight out. And it's just a huge mess. I do not know the current theory on this. I believe black was considered fine, which is why people don't do it for white. But it's kind of a fun line. But in general here, it's, you know, not played as much in favor of d3 and knight c3 kind of moves. So let's say you know that, but you've almost never looked at like the Schliemann deferred or the Janisch deferred, whatever you want to call it, and you've never looked at this. It's very tempting to want to play the same moves. I should say that a move like d3, against f5, a move like d3 is not too bad. I would say that this bishop doesn't always want to be here, but it's definitely like a playable option, I suppose. It definitely gives black, you know, additional options because you always have this b5 push and stuff like that. But it is playable. This knight c3 line I don't think works so well. But one of the cool things is that, again, the fact that you can kick this bishop with the move b5 is very annoying. However, there's a drawback to playing the deferred. And this is one that Vidit knew. So if you don't know this, it's really hard to figure it out. A move like d3, the reason why a d3 can be nice if you don't know it is because it's relatively safe. Like, sure, black can do this, but nothing horrible is really happening to you. You know, you can play, for example, knight c3, or even castles if you'd like, because taking this pawn looks very risky, and it's really just not, you know, nothing crazy is happening. If b5, you play bishop b3. If the bishop comes out, the typical idea is to play here, meaning that you don't want to allow black to castle so easily. One drawback is that because there's b5 all the time, it makes this a little bit more annoying. But even if they play b5, you play here and they can't castle, it definitely doesn't look so bad. So this is like a nice safe option if you don't know exactly how to handle it. Moves like d3 are kind of nice. You'll see a lot of experienced players do things like that if they're not familiar. But clearly Vidit knew this line, and most people know it. It's just very rare. So he played d4, the challenging move. So the reason why d4 is a bit better here, so in the game Praggnanandhaa takes, but if you go for this, and this is the key to spotting details in the opening, right? Why is this so much better for white? Well, this pawn is still very annoying on e5. The difference is you don't have the c6 tempo move anymore. c6 is no longer a tempo move. If c6, you can do a number of things probably. The simplest might just be a move like knight c3, for instance. And there's no check, there's no nothing. It's not a tempo move, right? It doesn't attack the bishop and allow black to take this pawn. So because the bishop's on a4, the interjection of these two moves really favors white. So the position goes from one where black has, you know, white has to sacrifice a piece to one where, you know, white's just doing great. So for that reason, black takes here. One advantage of taking here, again, is that you always have b5 as an option, which helps you in some positions. But the idea is that white plays this. So this is obviously known by Vidit. I'm guessing that he remembered this and not much else. But the nice thing is it is a very promising position for white. The pawn on e5 controls the f6 square, so it makes getting out the knight very annoying. The bishop has a nice diagonal. In general, it's just, you know, a pretty pleasant position. But of course, when your opponent has prepared their stuff and you have not prepared yours, it's always nerve-wracking. The nice thing is that if you know something's pretty decent, oftentimes you can play it without using that much time and at least see what your opponent's up to. Make them show their hand. This is a common thing. If you know moves are good, now that's not always the case, but if you know that, okay, doing this should be good, you can wait to see what your opponent does, and then you'll have a more concrete position to think about. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking 10 minutes here and playing a move like d4, which doesn't make sense to me. I think you either decide, okay, I'll play d3 and play it simple, or you decide, you know what, I'm going to take up the gauntlet, I'm going to go for this pawn sack, temporary pawn sack, and I'll see what they have in store, right? So in this case, Praggnanandhaa plays the move knight a7. So previously, I believe bishop b7 is a more common move. And then there's all sorts of things. There's moves like bishop g5. I believe that the move a4 is particularly annoying against this, which is why people don't play it as often. The general theme is that you're ready to take on b5 all the time, and it makes everything extremely loose. So you have a bunch of hanging stuff. So I don't know all the details, but from what I recall, that's an annoying thing, which is why people don't play this, right? But the move knight a5 is quite interesting. So the idea is that and this is something where it's kind of, I hate that, like, beginner players and stuff like this watch games like this, because this is just not how you should try to play as black. Again, unless you absolutely know everything. It's hard to explain, right? Like you're kind of scattering pieces. You put a pawn on f5, which is horrible. This pawn, like nothing really makes sense. But the whole concept is that because this knight on c6 in positions like this, and you do see this in other Lopez lines also, once you've played a6, b5, this knight feels wrong. The knight, black wants this, to advance all their pawns, right? So moves like this become desirable in lots of Lopez lines, not just this one. So the concept of knight a5 is not new. The main thing it does here, though, is if you look at this position, what is white's best piece? It's this bishop on b3. So trying to eliminate that piece, I think, is very worthwhile. So there's no real way to save it. Playing moves like bishop takes g8, these are the kind of moves I would say that, in my experience, amateur players overestimate. Because they're like, oh, you can't castle now, which is true. The drawback is that you've taken a piece that actually would have a very hard time developing, an undeveloped piece, and you're not really getting much for it. You're giving away your best bishop. So I understand the bishop was going to be given away anyway, but I don't really love this idea personally, because I think it's at the very least too soon. Black has all sorts of ways to get out of this. They just have to be careful. If knight takes d4, you have ideas like this, followed by taking the pawn. So probably a move like g6 would be warranted. I haven't checked a closer look at this, but something like this would be very logical to me, and probably life goes on. I'm not saying this is bad, but definitely black can get counterplay with the bishops and probably try to castle queenside at some stage. So it's very understandable he didn't want this. So he wanted to capture the d4 pawn. It's worth noting that because the move c5 can be answered by bishop d5, you can take it with either piece. So for example, he took this way, and then the move c5 would be answered probably by a move like bishop d5. So you don't have to worry about the bishop getting trapped as such. However, in my opinion, this is a major moment. Like, this is where you use your time, and I believe Vidit did just that. I think he used time in a way which I would think is very logical, meaning he played, I think, d4 and e5 relatively fast, and then he thought a fair amount here, which is the moment to do it, because here you have major choices. You could, of course, do a move like castles, right? The drawback is that castles does not really contribute to the center in any way, so it gives black an opportunity, for example, to play bishop b7, and now the move c5 is coming next and is a bit annoying. So one other thing I should mention about this is that a lot of the times the move bishop g5 is a good resource for white, but here I believe black can take here. There's queen takes, so this is what happens when I don't look, and the rook actually hangs, so you can't take this bishop. You can play a move like bishop b7, but that would be illogical here. I think here, though, bishop here, you can probably play bishop e7. Kind of, it's not a big deal, I guess. But the whole point I was making is that because the capture on f3 is possible, bishop g5 in some cases can be harder to play. As we're seeing, that's not always true. In any case, I don't think throwing in these moves is that useful for white. So he wants to take this pawn, and I'm guessing he was spending a lot of time deciding which way to take. I think it's really hard. It's really hard to make decisions like this. So once again, I think that when you're trying to navigate these kind of dangerous waters, when your opponent really knows what they're doing and you don't, this is an important thing. If you both don't know, it's a little different, because you can kind of come up with ideas. If you play a risky idea, it's not such a bad thing because your opponent doesn't have computer analysis in their head, right? But if you're in a situation where your opponent is still prepared and you are not, having that little bit of caution can be nice. And one thing I always look for are paths to get a simpler position, which maybe is quite playable. And I think that here, the simplest path to that would be queen takes d4. So the reason I mention this is because, first of all, if c5 trying to play c5, c4, you have the move bishop f7 check. This is a nice shot, very typical tactic. King e7 does not help, mainly due to this. So you take the bishop, queen d5 check, and black can do this and try to trap the queen, but in order to trap the queen, you'd have to move the queen, move the king, and also play here to unpin, right? Like, it's a lot of moves. And by that point, white could play, for example, knight c3 to d5 or a4 and try to break up the pawns. Any number of things are possible and probably very, very strong. So you don't really have to worry about getting your queen trapped. So c5 is not an issue. Knight takes b3, a takes b3, I don't think is actually a big deal. You have nice development here. You don't have to worry about your bishop getting trapped, so moves like c5 are now not very relevant. And I like actually having the queen out on d4. I think it's a reasonable piece. It's centrally located. It keeps life annoying for black. Notice how black still has to solve the problem of how to develop the king side. If the knight goes to e7, it blocks the bishop. If the bishop goes to e7, it blocks the knight. So I think that this is a very reasonable position for whites. So the move bishop b7 I think is most likely, and I'm guessing this is what he spent his time calculating. So once again here, this is where things are tricky because black is definitely threatening this. Attacking the queen and then trapping your bishop. So your move should have some impact there. Taking on g8 I don't really love. The bishop on b7 is great now, and we already kind of talked about this, that this is not ideal. However, I think we can play a move like bishop d5. This is what I was looking at sort of as the game was going. I didn't take as long a think or as deep a think as Vidit did. I'm also far weaker than him. But this is at least what I was thinking. And what I liked about this is that it looks very, very safe. So again, if I was facing some tactical prodigy who has stockfish in their head or whatever, not literally, but stockfish analysis, I would probably want to do something like this because I think it's relatively simple. If the knight retreats, you just go back. This bishop on d5 is really annoying. I think this is perfectly good. And if c6, now I'm prepared to take on g8. And the whole point is that I think I wanted to castle. I believe that knight c3 is supposed to be a better move. I did check this at least variation afterwards to make sure I was not leading everyone astray. This move may be a bit more accurate because you want to be able to play, like if they play c5, you want to park a knight on d5 often, things like this. I just wanted to castle. But the general idea is you do this, the knight comes out to c3, the bishop comes out, and even though black has two bishops, you have pretty good play. It's important to note that black was forced to push their c-pawn, which means that castling is going to be a lot riskier. It means the d5 square is available for your knight. I think it's just a very tricky position for black to play. I don't want to say that white is like so much better here or anything like that. I don't think it's that easy, but I definitely would rather be white, and I think that his position would be much simpler to play. So looking for these options where you get a position that's a little bit easier to play is very, very important. He plays knight takes d4, which is a very logical move, of course. And I don't know if he didn't expect bishop b7 by Praggnanandhaa. I suspect he did. But the problem he has here, and I was really struggling at this moment during the game when I was thinking, because I didn't really see anything that clear. He played the move knight takes f5, which I thought was very logical. It turns out it's an error. But to me, I thought it was logical. The main alternative is to play this and then take and allow c4. But what's absolutely amazing here is you can play the move knight c3 and it's actually like a lot of compensation. It's actually quite remarkable. And it's really funny to me because it reminds me of the piece sack I showed you, if you recall this piece sack, this whole thing from the earlier line, where you get this, knight c3 takes, and black has to play d5, etc. The piece sack that could have occurred in the game is actually very similar. You get this kind of position. I think the line that's given by the computer is something like this, but I was looking at, even a4 here and other things. But the point is that if black takes this bishop and you take, this knight on a5 feels really bad. You're going to park a knight on d5. You have knight d6 check all the time. If they ever try to get knight out, this is like a mate, for example. It's a funny variation. But it's almost impossible to evict all these pieces, and this is actually like really hard. But here's where the practical problems arise. In order to sacrifice a piece, you have to be fairly confident in your calculation, your judgment, and when your opponent is probably playing at blinding speed, this is a huge problem because it means they've looked at it. So sacrificing a piece when your opponent is computer prepared, I mean, that's a gutsy thing to do. I don't blame Vidit at all for not going for this, even though I think it's likely he calculated something like this, and I bet you it looked good to him. You know, when you see this position, it's not like you're like, oh, this is terrible, right? You're like, man, look at these pieces, look at this king, it's awful. Like, who plays like this? But, you know, if Leela or Stockfish says, yeah, this is good for black, it's kind of tough. It does not say that. It is actually pretty good for white. But to do this during a game, and this is where Praggnanandhaa's preparation really pays off, is just really hard to do. So he takes on f5, and he gets this position, which, to be fair, d6 is maybe not a move he anticipated. This is pretty crazy looking. But the general idea is that these pieces in this knight are not very stable. And if you take on d6, it allows black to develop some pieces, which is rather important, in fact. So this d6 move, trying to get rid of this pawn, you can see why white would rather have this pawn not on c7, because this move actually is largely possible due to that move. So, like, if white castles, for example, I was looking at this, but this is not too convincing, just giving the pawn. I was looking at something like this. I thought that black was at least fine. So he plays queen e2, which I think is logical. e6, and again, he's still kind of facing this prep, and he actually navigated reasonably well, but I think that he found himself in a position where he was down on the clock and had a very hard time. So once again, it's really hard. If you decide to take up the gauntlet and not just play the simple move like d3, you have to really have faith in your calculating ability and your judgment. One thing I would say is that while you have to be very careful as you're calculating, you don't want to blunder a piece. At some point, you're going to have to make a judgment call. Luckily, you're probably not going to be playing like, you know, you're not going to be playing someone as strong as Praggnanandhaa probably, and you're also not going to be playing someone who's booked to the teeth. So you're not going to have to worry about this as much. And what you should do, generally speaking, is at some point you have to make a judgment call. Do not use all your time. You know, calculate as best you can. I'm not saying you're not going to use more than your opponent, but you really want to make sure that you have some confidence in your judgment and decide, you know what, this is what I'm going to do. It'll be complicated. That's okay. And if you make a mistake, it's not the biggest deal. You have chances to get back in the game. And again, like, Vidit ended up actually with a very promising position, and I believe he blundered. So really, really fascinating play. It's really cool to see these openings in the candidates. It's obviously a bit of a fishy opening. You can almost guarantee he's not playing it again, maybe ever. But it's also very, very cool as a surprise weapon, and it's just nice to see we get positions which are very unusual. I would definitely not recommend anyone try to play this as black, though, unless they're very aware of what they're doing, let's put it that way. So the next one I want to show you is not so much an opening thing exactly, but it's something that you get from the opening sometimes. So this was a position from the game Nakamura Vidit. This was actually round 2. So black plays c6. So there are lots of options. You can take this bishop and take on d6, something like this. I think generally speaking, this is fine for black because this pawn looks nice, but it's going to be lost in a few moves, and black's very solid. This would be a possibility, though. I'm sure it's fine for white. Hikaru played back to d3, which I also think is normal. And here, of course, you have different things you can do. He could play a move like rook e1 or knight, you know, some developing move, but he decides, you know what, I believe I can grab this pawn, so I do. And then Vidit uncorks this move. This is the moment I want to talk about. This is the moment when your opponent shocks you with a move like this, a piece sack, a move you did not see coming, whether it's in prep or not. If it's in prep, of course, it's even scarier. But I think that these situations are very hard to handle correctly. For players of all levels, to give you an idea, I think Hikaru did not handle this in the best way. But it's a really difficult thing to deal with a move like this, because when your opponent sacks a piece, I guarantee you this move was not predicted, at least fairly sure. So the question is, how do you handle a move like this? I think that evaluation comes into play a lot. And what that means is you have to determine, well, if I take the bishop, that's obviously the ideal, right? To win a piece. But what is the evaluation if I don't? And one thing that occurs to me is that if you don't get to take that bishop, I don't really like white's position very much. And the reason for that is because our king is now missing a really crucial defender. So there's a concept that central pawns are more important than side pawns. I find that this is one of the most, overused concepts. I would say that, yes, having an e4 pawn when your opponent doesn't is nice, but at the same time, I would take this pawn and protect my king with it any day. Having an unsafe king is really a problem. So what that means is that any move that does not capture the bishop is, at least for me, undesirable. To give you an idea, in the game he played knight c4, but now after bishop g4, queen c2, bishop c7, it still got very complicated. He grabbed a pawn here, and apparently Vidit shouldn't have even done this. I think he had a better continuation. But even here, this looked massively unpleasant. Black has more pieces potentially out than you do. He's able to win this pawn, and it looks like an unpleasant position to have to play because you're underdeveloped and have a pretty unsafe king. I get that both sides have the two pawns. The problem is that black has this bishop aiming, this knight can get in the game very quickly, the queen can get in, and white does not really have this same luxury. I also want to point out that probably black could have also done this, I think is a reasonable move, to not allow you to take on h7. The drawback is you're able to take on b6, but even a position like this, I did not think was all that great. This king is still quite weak. You can't really develop pieces in a nice way. And just playing with a king like this all the time is just such a pain. So what that means is that the onus on you to calculate taking on h3 is greater. Because if you have an undesirable position, if you don't take the bishop, it means that the likelihood you should take it or try to take it is higher. So why is that important? Well, you'll see what I mean. So when I was calculating capturing the bishop, the first thing I thought of was queen c7, but after bishop f4, I decided that this was nonsense. Like, what are you doing? If knight h5, the bishop goes back, you're still protecting the knight, everything's great. But it didn't take me too long to realize his idea was queen b8. So what this does is, it hits the knight on e5. If the knight tries to retreat, you give this check. Ouch. Queen takes h3, knight h2. You can survive for a moment, but after this move, I realized that life was going to be massively unpleasant. Your king just does not have a safe haven, and your pieces are not able to defend you in an adequate way. That's, I'd say, the main problem you have. Your pieces are just too poor to help defend your bishop. And if you play a move like f3, now your king is even more vulnerable. Moves like knight h5, the idea being knight g3 mate. And this position, I think, is just not salvageable. I have no doubt that Hikaru didn't want any piece of this. However, when I looked at this position, the main thing I saw was, okay, I can still play bishop f4, and the idea is clearly bishop c7. At first, I was like, okay, if they can just take the knight, that's probably bad for us, right? Our king is wide open. I would rather take my chances with the pawn on g2. It's very possible Hikaru thought something like this as well. I didn't check the interviews or his recap or anything like that. But here, what I thought we could do is play bishop back here. Bishop takes e5, and then f4. And this solution I thought was okay. Black retreats. We play a move like queen f3, for instance. Again, I don't know if this is absolutely best, but it looked very logical to me. Then we're going to get our knight out, get our rook out. We have these two pawns on f4 and e4. At first, I actually quite liked white's position, but then I realized that we still have... Our king is still not great. There's knight g6. There's some pressure on our pawns. It's hard to play... Like, moves like e5 are difficult with the knight coming in. I still think it's unclear, though. The queen on b8 leaves a weird impression. They're probably going to have to fix it. I think we're doing okay. And the key is to be able to evaluate this from this position. If you can calculate till the point where you get your bishop on h2 and play f4, I think that it's likely you'll take the bishop. But notice how in this kind of situation, calculating to the end is very important, but as much as calculation is evaluation. And I think the big thing to evaluate is that if you leave this bishop just on the board, if you just play some move and decline to take it, your king is going to be extremely weak with a lot of forces on the board. Most of these forces look very, very intimidating, at least to me. And again, I mean, the queen's ready to come in. There's all sorts of potential problems here. So I think that it's very important to realize that if you leave the bishop on the board, and this was something that Nakamura experienced when he got this position, it just was very unpleasant. And it was still unclear. Like, this position, I think he's supposedly doing okay. But this is one of those where the computer kind of tells you that, yeah, it's not so bad for white, but from a human perspective, playing a position like this is absolutely miserable. And he lost like quite badly, and of course he's a very solid player who almost never loses, so it gives you an idea of how difficult the position can be to play. So handling moments like this, when you see bishop takes h3 on the board, it's scary. And as you can see, even players who are super advanced can mess this up, right? And the key though is how do you handle it? Again, ideally your opponent's not in computer prep. That's a harder thing to deal with, because then you're really scared to take the piece. But I'd say the most important thing is not to be too scared of capturing a piece that's offered. It doesn't mean you're necessarily going to win. As you can see here, you don't even have a better position most likely. But taking on h3 leads to the position where you have at least some play. You're relatively safe. You get your pieces out. You have some pawns that are decent. Your king's a bit open, but you at least have compensation for that. And I would say that if you evaluate that properly, in addition to the initial position, it will really help you make the right choices when you're faced with a move like this. It's really hard to do. We've all been there, and it's really hard to do correctly. But the main things, again, remain calm. Evaluate very carefully, not just calculate, but also calculate your lines very precisely. Even if they're not terribly long lines, you want to make sure they're really correct. You don't want to take a piece and get mated in a few moves, right? And I would say it's a hard part of the game to do well. It's definitely something I know I've done wrong many times, either by accepting a piece sack and not calculating it carefully and losing badly, or declining it too hastily. I've done both mistakes, and I know how hard it is. But I know that clear thinking and not panicking and really making those judgment calls is the best way to have a chance to make the decisions correctly. So I hope you're enjoying these videos. I hope you're enjoying the candidates. It's a really fun tournament to follow, however you choose to follow it, whether it's with a broadcast, just the games in the background, whatever you're doing. But if you're able to kind of follow some of the games real time and really try to find moves, that's the way to really train, like to try to improve by watching, generally speaking. And it's definitely something I like to do. And I hope that you enjoyed some of these insights and found it useful. If you like these videos, once again, like, subscribe, do all that, make some comments. I try to answer the questions and stuff like that in the comments when I can. And once again, I appreciate the support of the channel. All that really helps. If you're interested in my chessable course, it is linked below. It's targeted at beginners and like early intermediate players. It's on beginner mistakes in the opening. And my next course is hopefully going to get released in the next couple months or so. They haven't given me a time frame yet, but I'm looking forward to that. And in the meantime, I will see you guys next time.